Today we're going to talk about a method for analyzing performance problems. And I've taken this methodology from a book by Robert Mager and Peter Pipe called, interestingly enough, Analyzing Performance Problems, and subtitled, They Really Oughta Wanna. And that subtitle refers to the fact that Mager says, employees really ought to want to do things right, but sometimes they don't. And as managers, it's important for us to figure out why not. Originally, Mager and Pipe wanted to help companies save money on training expenses because they felt that in many instances employees were being trained who actually didn't need training at all, and that was an expense that companies didn't need to have to deal with. But I think this methodology offers many more interesting lessons to managers and supervisors, and if followed, I think can really make a difference in the speed and the accuracy with which we address performance issues. As we go through the method, I'd like you to think of someone in your life, preferably a current employee, who is not performing up to expectations. If you can't think of a current employee, a former employee, colleague, or even friend or family member will do. Teenage children often present interesting cases, and then when we get together, we'll talk about the cases, but we won't use any names. Okay, so let's get started. The first thing you need to do, obviously, if you're dealing with an employee who isn't performing up to snuff, is to describe the performance problem itself. And I'm going to invent a scenario for us. Let's say we've got an employee named Joe, and he's always at least a day late in submitting data from his team that will then be used in the unit report. The next question you have to ask, say Mager and Pipe, is this one. Is it important? Now that may seem like a dumb question, but I've worked with a lot of people who are simply annoyed by aspects of employee behavior. But if they were honest with themselves, they'd realize that their complaint is just not all that important in the scheme of things. Often what annoys us is how the employee accomplishes the task, even when he or she actually meets the goal. So it's important to ask this question and be completely honest about the answer. I have a friend who puts it this way: is this a ditch I want to die in? When we talked the last time, you all mentioned micromanagement as an issue, and I think this question, is it really important, is a great way to avoid the pitfall of micromanagement. So if whatever the employee is doing is just not that important, then Mager says we ignore it. If it is important, then the next thing we have to ask ourselves is it a skill deficiency? In order to figure out whether or not an employee actually has a skill deficiency, Mager says, ask yourself this question. Could he do it if his life depended on it? If the answer is no, then you know you're dealing with a skill deficiency. If you came up to me and you said, solve this problem in analytical calculus or I'll shoot you, I'd have to say, go ahead and shoot me, because I don't know how to do that. I have a skill deficiency when it comes to calculus. On the other hand, if I could do it, if threatened, that means I know how to do it, and that makes for a very, very different sort of scenario. So let's say, yes, it is a skill deficiency. And if it's a skill deficiency, then there are a number of other questions that you need to ask yourself in order to determine how to solve the problem. If it's a skill deficiency and it's something that I used to do but don't do any longer, then you want to ask yourself another question: is it a skill that I use often? And depending upon the answers to those questions, you'll then determine the best solution. If it's something that I don't know how to do and I've never done it before, then clearly a formal training session is in order. If it's something that I don't know how to do now but I used to know how to do, then perhaps some practice would be a possibility, or perhaps feedback might be all I need. Here, do it this way. But those are some possible ways to deal with a skill deficiency. So once we've determined that a problem is not the result of a skill deficiency, then Mager suggests there's still a number of questions that we have to ask ourselves. The first one is good performance punishing? And some things we might want to think about are, what are the consequences of performing as desired? Is it punishing to perform as expected? Do employees perceive desired performance as being geared to penalties in some way? Would the employee's world become a little dimmer if the desired performance were attained? One particularly interesting way in which organizations sometimes make good performance punishing is that they tend to load extra work on the people who are the best performers. So if I do a good job, I'm always on time, it's easier to have me do the job than it is to ask someone else to do it. And so the next thing you know, I'm completely overloaded. And let me give you another example outside of the workplace where good performance is sometimes punished, and that is in school. In certain cultures, in certain schools, students who perform very well, very bright students, can often be picked on and teased by their peers, and that punishment may in fact lead them to perform less well in school. Whatever the cause of the good performance being punished, however, the solution, if possible, is to try to remove the punishment. The next question we have to ask is non-performance rewarding? And often that's the other side of the coin of performance being punishing. If I don't do what I'm supposed to do, eventually perhaps people simply stop asking, and so now I don't have to do it at all. Someone else picks up the slack, and I've been rewarded for my poor performance. And again, if you think of the school example, a student who loses out in good grades may be rewarded for his poor performance by gaining friendship or praise from his peers. So here's some questions you can ask yourself about non-performance being rewarding. What do employees get out of the present performance in the way of reward or prestige or status? Do employees get more attention for misbehaving than behaving? What event in the world supports the present way of doing things? Am I inadvertently rewarding irrelevant behavior while overlooking crucial behaviors? Are employees either mentally or physically inadequate, doing less so there's less to worry about, doing less because it's less tiring? The third question is, does performance really matter? And by that, Mager means, do employees perceive that that good performance matters to their supervisors? Does it matter to them? Do they receive favorable outcomes for performance? If I'm doing everything right all the time and I never get any recognition for it, I might stop doing it. You'll notice on the flow chart that the solution for both non-performance being rewarding and the question of whether or not performance matters is the same thing. Mager calls it arranging consequences. But what he really means here, I think, is making sure that in both cases, employees understand that the correct performance, the right performance, does matter. And you can convey that in a number of ways through simple feedback, through either negative or positive consequences, so that people recognize that the kind of work they're doing does matter. The final question is, are there obstacles? And in many cases, employees face obstacles that we're not aware of, and we need to ask ourselves questions, such as, do the employees really know what's expected of them? Are there conflicting demands on employees' time? Do they lack the authority to do things the way you want them to be done? Do they lack the time, or perhaps the tools? Are there restrictive policies or a right way of doing things or a way we've always done it that ought to be changed? And can I reduce competition from the job? Things like phone calls and crises that seem urgent but are not really all that important. If we determine that obstacles are getting in the way of the kind of performance that we're looking for, then the solution is to look to see which and how many of those obstacles can be removed. with these questions in front of you, I want to tell you a story that happened to me, and that will show you some of the power of Mager's analysis. I was a director of training for a bank, and one day the chief counsel came storming into my office, and he was really angry, and he throws a piece of paper down on my desk and says, "Can you fill out this form? Is this form clear to you?" And I looked at the form. I said, "Yeah, it's pretty clear to me." And I talked to him to find out what he was angry about, and he kept saying, "You've got to train them. You've got to develop a training program for these employees." And I said, "Well, all right, now we'll slow down and tell me what the problem is." Well, the problem was that the employees in question were people who made decisions about whether or not to give applicants consumer loans. So I apply for a loan, for example, to buy a car, and these were the people who looked at my credit record and all kinds of things and determined, yes, I would be given the loan, or no, I would not be given the loan. And actually by law, they were required to answer 2 questions if a person was turned down for a loan. The first question was, where did you get the information to determine whether or not to give this person a loan? And they could answer that question simply by checking a box on the form. And 99.9% of the time, the box they checked was the Toledo Credit Bureau. So they got the information to determine that they would not give you a loan from the Toledo Credit Bureau. But they were also supposed to check another box by law. And that box was, why did you turn this person down for the loan? And they were not checking that box. And evidently some 5,000 of these things had gone out with that box unchecked. And so the bank was in violation of some sort of federal banking law, and the chief counsel obviously was very angry. And I said, "Well, so why do you think they're not checking the boxes?" I said, "Do they not know the reason that the person was turned down?" And the reason could be something like they were overcommitted. They had too many loans outstanding already, or it could be they'd been through bankruptcy. I mean, there were a number of boxes that they could have checked. And he said, "No, yeah, they know the reason. They're the ones who make the decision. So it isn't like they don't know the answer to the question. Of course they know the answer to the question." And so as we talked, I'm asking some of these questions, and as it turned out, there were no consequences at all to those employees for not checking the box on a day-to-day basis. No supervisor looked it over before it went out. Obviously, the consumers who got the notice didn't realize the box was supposed to be checked, and so they didn't get any flack from anybody. But it's pretty interesting to notice that performance was punishing in this instance and non-performance rewarding because of 1 second saved that it would have taken them to check that box. So, it's a pretty interesting case from the point of view of analyzing why people don't do things, and the very tiniest rewards or punishments can move a person off center, if you will. In any case, we didn't do a training program because I couldn't figure out how I was going to do a training program to teach people to check a box they already knew they were supposed to check. So what we did is we simply added a sentence on the form. And the sentence said, "In compliance with federal law, if you are turned down for a loan, you have a right to know the reason. One of the above boxes will be checked to indicate the reason for the denial." And that completely solved the problem. As soon as these people realized that an angry customer, for example, might come back to them and say, "Why didn't you check this box?" Then it became less punishing and more rewarding to check the box than not to check it, and that solved the problem. Obviously, once you've analyzed the problem carefully, you need to lay out some possible solutions and choose the best one, and we'll talk about that a little bit when we get together on February 21st. Also, for February 21st, I hope you come prepared to ask me some questions about this methodology and perhaps to walk through a couple of scenarios from your own experience. If there are still people who aren't complying with your in-process inspection policy, for example, we should talk about that.